So we move into a different place and a different space and a different time. We take ourselves and our imaginations and our hearts and our souls, and we move far to the north, to a place next to a great bay with a cliff and a village on top of that cliff, to a people who fished, hunted that area. Maybe this was a long time ago. Maybe it's a long time in the future. Maybe it's right now. But in this village, there were a small group of people who lived closely together. And among these people, there was a little girl who was born, who, when she was born, she cried out and she wailed and made noise. And she laughed and she scrambled about, and she was, in a word, precocious. And so it was that as she grew, she got into lots of trouble. She was hungry for the things that were new. She loved to go to the edge of the village and collect flowers in the springtime. And as she grew older and could walk on her own, she would oftentimes follow the hunters and the fishermen, get lost. And she was a pain to her parents. And I'm sure that none of us here know what that's like. And so it was that as she grew, that precociousness became such a burden, not to her, but to her father in particular. And one day, she had done something that so enraged him, so infuriated him, that all he saw was red. And his anger grew up into his head and out to his arms and down to his feet in such a way that it boiled in his belly. And he took the girl, his daughter, and he dragged her to the edge of that cliff. And no matter what she said, no matter what she did, no matter how hard she fought, he threw her over the edge of the cliff and into the bay to float there as long as she could, until finally she sunk beneath the waves to the bottom of that sea, and there the fish ate her flesh and her eyes until all that was left was a skeleton that rolled this way and that as the tide moved in and out, took her rolling in the bottom amongst the fish until her bones were bleached white with the salt water. Now the people, they don't remember what it was that caused this enraged father to do this thing. But it soon came about that the fishermen no longer wanted to fish in that bay. See, the haunt of that pervaded everything. And it didn't take too long before the people, needing to find sustenance some other place, began to drift away. And the fishermen from the nearby villages, they too stopped fishing there, for they would come and they would drop their lines. But soon they would pull their lines back up again and they would leave, never to return. And so it was that this particular body of water sat quiet with no one fishing, no villages nearby. And the solitude of the skeleton woman who rolled under the sea there grew deeper and deeper and deeper. A long ways away, there was another village. And in this village, there was a young fisherman, an odd man, who was not really shunned by his people, but he wasn't welcomed by them either. See, he lived on the edges. And he fished for the people, for that was the only thing that he was welcome to do. And because of his solitude, because of his sense of aloneness, because of his pull to the waters, he would oftentimes travel for days in his kayak, fishing with his precious fishing stick that had been gifted to him by his grandfather. He had a long gut line and a bone hook. And he would bring back fish, but he was never welcome. And so it happened that one day he began a journey. And it was a long journey. It seemed like it took forever. Maybe it was many days, maybe it was many weeks. I don't know. But one thing we do know, what the stories tell us, is that he made his way to that bay. And when you looked across it, there was something eerie that pervaded. But there was also something compelling. And so he brought his kayak in over those still quiet waters. And as he floated there, he got his stick and his gut line and his hook ready, and he dropped them deep into the waters. And he sat there contemplating the quiet. And so it was that as that hook bounced along the bottom, it found its way to the skeleton woman that lay there. And in a very mysterious way, that hook dropped into the breast, in between the chest bones, in between the ribs, and hooked itself there above where her heart once sat. And feeling the tug of the hook, the fisherman thought to himself, wow, I've caught myself something large, something big. Maybe this is a fish that will feed the people for a long time. He began to pull. And as he did, that hook lodged itself into the breastbones of that skeleton woman, and she, feeling the pull, began to twist this way and that, trying to dislodge the hook. And as she did, the waters above began to froth and lift, and the waves began to roll in, and the fisherman, he pulled. And she twisted this way and that until she was hopelessly twisted up in the gut line in such a way that there was no way for her to dislodge that hook. And then the fisherman began to pull, and he pulled her upwards, inexorably, toward the light.
Now, just before the skeleton woman broke the surface of the water, it happened that the fisherman turned his eyes away. He turned his back, and he reached for his net to pull up this great fish. And so he was turned away, reaching for his net at the moment that skeleton woman broke the surface of the water. And he pulled her up with his line, not looking, until she was hanging on the side of his boat. In fact, her top teeth rested on the gunwale of his little kayak. And when the fisherman turned around with his net, expecting to see a wonderful fish to scoop up, he instead saw her bleached white skull and her barnacle-encrusted teeth hanging on the edge of his kayak. The fisherman let out a terrible scream, a terrible howl. It echoed off the cliffs. It echoed off the very cliff that the skeleton woman's father had pitched her off of. It echoed far out to sea. The fisherman howled in terror. And he dropped his net and he grabbed his paddle and he knocked the horrible thing off of his kayak. And he began paddling as he'd never paddled before, paddling for home. But of course, the skeleton woman was still hooked, was still tangled up in his gut line. And so even though he paddled and even though he zigzagged, looking back over his shoulder at the terrible thing, he never gained any ground on her. She followed his kayak wherever he went. And in fact, because he was paddling so fast, Skeleton Woman began to skip over the water and over the waves behind him. And it began to look as if she were crawling and reaching at him with her arms across the waves, threatening to pull him down with her bony fingers. And this only increased his panic and his terror. The fisherman paddled as he'd never paddled before. He paddled all the way back to his village, not stopping, in utter terror. Skeleton Woman right behind him, crawling along on the waves behind him. And when he reached the beach of his home village, he didn't stop. He pulled up right up on the rocks of the village, and in one motion, he sprang from his kayak. And I don't know exactly why. Maybe it was because it was his habit. Maybe it was because that fishing stick had belonged to his grandfather. But for whatever reason, even in his terror and in his panic, the fisherman took his fishing stick along with him. And he ran up the beach. But of course, Skeleton Woman, still entangled in his line, came rolling right up the beach with him. And the fisherman ran across the tundra. He ran even across the place where the meat was laid to dry, and he was breaking the frozen meat with his mucklucks. At one point, Skeleton Woman reached over and she grabbed a piece of fish that was there to dry. And she ate that bit of fish. And it had been so long since she'd had a taste of food in her mouth. Now, the fisherman didn't even slow down. He ran right to his little snow lodge, his little snow house, and he dove into the tunnel of that snow house. And he crawled right into the back of his little dark lodge there, his little dark snow house. And there he lay panting and praying in his terror in the dark, praying to Raven, praying to Sedna, the sea mother, protect me, mother, protect me, Raven, from that terrible thing. He lay there a long time in the dark, listening to the drumbeat of his own heart echoing in his ears. But eventually, the fisherman in the dark in his own lodge calmed down, began to feel somewhat safe again. And at some point, he reached into his pouch and he grabbed his fire kit. And he struck a little spark and he lit a little whale oil lamp. And when the light filled his little lodge, he could see that in there with him was the Skeleton Woman, lying tangled in his line, tangled in a heap in the side of his lodge. Now, I don't know if it was the firelight. I don't know if it was the fact that it had been a long time since anyone had been in that fisherman's lodge. I don't know if it was because he had used up all the fear he had. But for whatever reason, he didn't react to the Skeleton Woman in terror anymore. And he actually went over to her and he took pity on her. And with his rough fisherman's hands, he began the work of untangling that gut line of his from the bones of Skeleton Woman. And as he did that, he began to sing to her the way a mother might sing to an upset child. Oh, na, 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 na. Oh, na, 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 na. And he worked slowly and carefully to untangle that line. Being a fisherman, he was used to tangled lines, and so he had a lot of patience for that work. And he kept untangling and unwrapping that line and singing all the while his little song. Oh, na, 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 na. Oh, na, 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 na. It took a long time, but eventually he disengaged that line from the bones of Skeleton Woman, and he unhooked the bone hook from her breastbone and set his fishing stick and the line aside. And he turned to her and he saw that Skeleton Woman was all tangled up in herself. Her foot was caught up in her rib cage and one arm was wrapped strangely around her neck. And he took pity on her and he began to disentangle the bones from one another and to set them out in the shape of a human body in the places where they would belong. Still singing his little song to her. He did all this, and when this was accomplished, when he had straightened out the bones, he took some furs and some blankets, and he clothed her and wrapped her in these furs. And then he reached into his fire kit again, and he pulled out some makings, and he struck up a little fire in the lodge so that he and her might have warmth. And when the fire was going, he reached over to his fishing stick. And this, the precious wood of which he oiled, as he always did when he was back from the sea fishing. And when he had oiled the fishing stick, he wound the gut line around the fishing stick in the way that he kept it. When this was done, he put it in its place. And when he had finished all that, a deep exhaustion fell over him from all that he had been through that day. And the fisherman climbed into his sleeping place and he pulled up the blankets and he went to sleep. Now, all this while, Skeleton Woman lay there, not daring to move, not daring to make a sound. She was so afraid that the fisherman would react again in terror, might drag her out of the lodge, might take her on to the terrible rocks and break her bones and cast her back into the sea. So she lay there quietly, watching the fisherman sleep for a long time. And that's where we will leave them for now.
So remember back at the beginning of this story time how there was a little girl who was born into a village, all precocious and problematic. And remember the rage of a father who was offended in some way that we do not know, who threw her into the waters below the village, into a bay, where she sank to the bottom. The fish ate her flesh and she became a skeleton. And how the people no longer fished in that particular way. And soon very few came near ever again. And remember that there was a young man in a different village far away who was alone, somewhat of a loner, an odd person. And how in his journeys he found his way to this very same bay and noticed something both eerie and compelling. Enough to where he dropped his line into that water, and how that line, that gut line, hooked into the breast of that skeleton woman who was rolling back and forth in the currents beneath the sea. And how as he began to pull, his wonder whether or not he would have a large fish to feed his people, and how she twisted and turned and a great froth and waves came up as she was drawn to the light. And remember that when he turned to get his net, she lifted above the water and her skeleton head hooked on the gunwale of the kayak. And when he turned, he jumped in a great fright and tried to knock her free and began paddling furiously to the shore. And remember that when he reached the shores of his village, he leapt out of his kayak and ran as fast and fiercely as he possibly could, taking with him only his precious fishing stick given to him by his grandfather, who he was quite connected with. And remember that the fish line was still tangled in the skeleton woman, and she followed, clattering along, until finally he reached his snow hut, and he leapt into the dark opening, only to sit at the back of that hut in the darkness, breathing furiously, listening for that apparition that had followed him in that long, terrifying journey. And remember that when his breathing finally slowed and the fear finally settled, he lit his small oil candle, and there he saw the assemblage of bones wrapped with fishing net line, and how some piece of compassion and pity and something warm encouraged him to carefully and gently untangle the bones of the line. And how in that same vein, he assembled those bones back into their proper places until finally there was an assembly that looked just like a human being. And he gently covered her up with a blanket, put a small pillow beneath her skeleton head. And when he had completed that, he wrapped the fishing line up, put his fishing stick, well oiled, back in its proper place, and he sat there in the dim light. He lit a little bit of fire with some hair from his head. And remember that as he gazed upon her, a great sleepiness came over him. And soon he fell asleep while she lay there, afraid to move even a tiny bit, for fear that he would awaken and take her back out and break her bones on the stones, losing her life forever. And remember that that's where we left him, sleeping in his bed, and her laying there on the floor, all assembled properly, but no flesh on her bones. And so the young fisherman, he lay there sleeping, the deep sleep of somebody that has experienced a tremendous amount of fear and exertion, tempered by the compassion and warmth of the heart that came forth inside the darkness. And as the flame began to dim, as people will do when they dream, a tear appeared in his eye. We don't know what causes these tears. They come unbidden. But this tear began to glisten in the dim light, and the skeleton woman laying there looked at the sleeping young man. And she caught sight of that tear as it began to roll slowly and gently down his cheek. And as she gazed at this tear, a great thirst rose up inside of her. Such a great thirst that she could no longer continue to lay there. So carefully, oh, so carefully, she lifted the blankets from her, and she slowly clattered her way across the floor, taking as much care as possible not to make any more noise than she possibly could. And she neared the bed of the young fisherman. And she leaned down. She took her skull head and leaned down towards that tear that was rolling down his cheek. And with her lower jaw, the teeth of her lower jaw, she laid those teeth gently on his cheek tear rolled into her skeleton mouth, and it was like a river that quenched that thirst that had been with her for so long. And she slacked her thirst and she drank it down, and she slacked her thirst further and further until finally, relief had come to her. And in the dimness of that candlelight, she lifted the blankets from the young man. And she took her skeleton hand. She reached it underneath his shirt, lifting his shirt up. And she took those bony fingers and she reached into his belly beneath his rib cage up to where his beating heart lay. And she carefully lifted that beating heart out of the young man's chest. And she held it up. And she began to play the heart like a great drum. Boom, 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 boom. And she began to sing. And this is what she said. She sang, flesh, 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 boom, boom, flesh, flesh, flesh. And as she sang, flesh began to appear on her body. First the connective tissues and the muscles and all of the organs. Flesh, flesh. And then skin appeared all over her body, nails on her toes and fingers. Her hands became plump and fat and strong, and she grew the cleft between her legs and long breasts to wrap around and keep warm on all the things that a woman needs. She grew in beautiful, bright, clear eyes and long, dark hair. Flesh. She kept playing that drum in her heart. And then, after she was sung into a complete form of a lovely young woman, she sang his clothes off of his body until he was naked. And she nestled her naked body next to him, and she slowly and carefully, gently put that heart back into his chest. And she curled up next to him, skin on skin, and together they finally fell asleep. And it was in this tangle that they awoke, this new kind of tangle that they awoke in the morning, having consummated their relationship. Now it's said by the people, and many of whom did not know where she came from. It's said by the people that wherever they went, wherever these two went, the bounty of the sea. And when the people were hungry, young fishermen would go out into the waters, and the sea life would come forth. That sea life that she had been living with for so long came forth and offered themselves. And that bounty fed the people until finally they grew old enough to have children. Their children had children. And so it's said that these two lived a full and rich life. And their children lived also a full and rich life. So this is the story that and came to Walton. And Walton has the story of how this story came to us. And so when he's ready, I'd like to share that with you.
Well, it seems the fisherman and his wife one day were recounting the story of how they met to their children, and they were sitting on a rocky beach. And who should overhear that story but a young seal? You know, seals are curious animals. They poke their head up out of the sea to see what's going on, and they dive down deep. And that's what gives the story its ups and downs. And so the story was carried by the seal people for many generations of seals, and it might have remained with them. But one year, there was a seal who had poked his head up and was looking around, and he was eaten by a great orca whale. And the story went into the orca people. And the Orca people carried it from the far north to the deep south, back and forth for many generations of orcas. And that's what gives the story its dark parts and its bright parts, like the coloring of the orca. And it might have remained with the orcas, but one year, an orca was giving birth to a calf. And something went wrong. Maybe the calf didn't get up to the surface soon enough. In any event, that calf didn't make it. And the orcas sang their mourning song over that lost calf as the calf drifted slowly down to the bottom of the sea. And there at the sea bottom, the flesh of that dead calf was eaten by some crabs. And the story went into the crab people, and they carried it protected in their shells for many generations of crabs for hundreds of years. But it fell out one year that some crab fishermen pulled up a load of crabs, and they took those crabs to market, and that market sold some crab to a pub. And my brother Ben and I went into that pub one day, and we had an order of crab cakes, and the story went into us, and now we've told you.